Thank you very much. Well, joining us now with more on the president's action is KTVU political analyst Brian Sobel. And Brian, President Trump taking a firm stance here, saying that he may deploy military inside the U.S. Talk a little bit more about this act, which allows him the ability to do so.
Yes, Heather, this is the Insurrection Act of 1807. It's been employed. It was employed during the 1968 reactions to the assassination of Martin Luther King. It was used again in 1992, as the package earlier discussed. Here's a statistic, though. After the riots around the Rodney King beating, there were 13,500 soldiers and Marines on the ground in L.A. About 2,000 active duty Army, about 1,500 active duty Marines, and the rest National Guards, men from around the state of California. And what we're seeing now is 15 or 16 states have National Guards men and women out in the cities, including the District of Columbia.
Yeah, so let's talk a little bit more about what the president said today. We've obviously touched on this sort of, hardline stance, if you will, on the violence, the looting, the vandalism. But he didn't focus at all, Brian, on the protesters' grievances, such as systemic racism and police misconduct.
Well, sadly, this happens with these protests quite often, is they start out with very well-intentioned people, and they have a grievance, and in this case, it's a terrible thing that occurred, and people want to emote about it. But then pretty soon, some of these protests morph into something else. And so what you see dominating the TV screens are pictures of looters and other people. And so the story gets lost. The original story gets lost. That's what is so painful about watching the looting and the other acts going on, because it takes away from what our nation's attention ought to be on, which is the case of police violence in Minneapolis and systemic violence against young blacks in particular. And that's what we ought to be talking about.
Right. And so do you think here that the president missed an opportunity to address those concerns, and also, Brian, to really heal a nation that is hurting right now and is so divided?
Well, I really think he ought to be speaking to the nation. I think he ought to speak to the nation from the Oval Office and not from the Rose Garden during an afternoon chat. I think it should have more national importance. And I think at the same time, he is watching cities with a great deal of trouble tonight and saying, hey, we're not going to put up with that anymore. But to your point, I think there's an original issue here that needs to be addressed.
Yeah, I think a lot of people are waiting on the president to do just that, to address those issues. And we'll have to wait and see exactly what happens in regards to the military. Brian Sobel, always appreciate your comments. Thank you so much.
Great chatting with you.